Well, good evening. I'm Denny Smith. Welcome to the show. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, that is the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. It was assembled and written by Thomas Jefferson in 1776. It was a draft of many, and yet it was the one that stuck. Tonight we're going to go back to the beginning of this of this country, and ask the questions for which many need answers, including if this nation was indeed founded on Judeo-Christian principles by Christian men, how would Jesus feel about some of the things we have both in our Constitution and in our law? First of all, I want you to know I'm welcoming your calls this evening. We're not going to do this without your help. 239-9393. 1-800-571-9422, and it's pound 9393 on your Verizon cell phone. This week I received an email that got the seeds of this particular evening going. In a minute I'm going to read you the email that I received. But before I do that, I'd like to introduce you to a friend of mine that I have invited into the studio to engage in some intellectual debate. The Reverend Dr. James McKibbin hails from a dairy farm outside Warsaw, Indiana. He's just a farm boy, as he describes himself to me, and he currently lives in Austin, Texas, with his wife, Betsy, but he's serving an interim ministry here in Indianapolis. He's become my friend, and I think you'll welcome his perspective this evening. James, welcome to the show. How are you?
Well, thank you, Mr. Smith. Great to be here.
Mr. Smith, here we go. James, there seems to be no question whatsoever that our founding fathers were all deeply grounded in the Christian faith, and they wanted their new nation to bear witness to the fact that they were Christians. The Constitution they gave us has withstood nearly 250 years, and yet it sometimes puts us in a position that makes us wonder about certain things. I'm going to read an email here, and then we'll start listening to you all, and James and I will sort of chime in here. Hey, Denny, I just heard a split second of your conversation on Garrison with a caller today, but I think it's centered around a point that I hear made from time to time. Basically, it's the idea that America was founded on Judeo-Christian values. Now, I've always heard that, and never given it much thought until recently. I guess my question is this. What fundamental American principles do we have that are exclusive to Judeo-Christian faiths? Now, I would agree that we hold to be our values can be found in more religions than Christianity. I would also add that anyone that thinks Jesus Christ would have been a capitalist is way off base. Wasn't Jesus very much in favor of the redistribution of wealth? Perhaps not mandated, but I certainly don't think he would have been a fan of our economic system. You have any thoughts on this? James, I got to tell you, when I got that email, I sent you a copy of it right off the bat.
That's correct.
And, all right, so let's just start right there. Was Jesus a capitalist or a socialist?
Well, as I read the Gospels, it doesn't appear to me that he was either. It's more that he was interested in people having a relationship with God and with each other. And as a result of that, his position always was to bring the kingdom of heaven onto earth, to love as God loved, to make it to reign on the just and the unjust.
You know, our European roots, our founding fathers, they saw authoritarian law overseas. They had come from that, and the king was vested with these rights and got a direct he had a hotline to God, and really it was this authoritarian law, and I think it just peed them off. I think that they were not in any mood for that. So they come over, and first of all, is there any question that our founding fathers were Christians?
I think they interpreted the faith as Christian, and they, as best they understood what it was they had to deal with, they dealt with it in Christian perspective.
And yet they preferred freedom of religion. I thought that they were... let's go back just a little bit. We say Judeo-Christian. What does that really mean? What is common about Jews and Christians?
Well, the common characteristic and definition for both Jews and Christians is that the Ten Commandments are the Jewish side of the Judeo-Christian faith. When you bring it to the Christian faith, then Jesus narrows down those Ten Commandments and says, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and soul. And then
that was one.
That's one. And then love your neighbors yourself, which includes all of the rest of the commandments. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not
all right, so
swear against God.
So same God, same principles.
Same God, same principles.
All right, so it doesn't matter whether we're Hebrew or if we're Christian. That's where we are. So our forefathers come over, and they are upset with the authoritarian law of the Europeans, and they say, we want this to be a free nation. We want it to be a free nation, and we want it to be free of any religious dictates. But yet, do you sense that, from your perspective, the Reverend Dr. James McKibbin's perspective, do you sense that they wanted everybody to be Christian, or where were they going with that?
Well, it's hard to interpret in a vacuum what they were really thinking or what they really had in mind. And they certainly had before them the very Bible that all of us read. And, of course, having good minds, they were able to make an interpretation about that. And then to share that with a group of people, what they really wanted to have was they wanted to have freedom to pray as they wanted to pray without the dictation of a king or someone else. They wanted to be kind of separated from being ordered to pray.
I can't help but think that they expected the nation to remain Christian. Right now I hear, in fact, folks, I'm going to open up the lines to this one question. Obama says that we are no longer a Christian nation. And that floored me, but yet we have always seen ourselves as Judeo-Christian as a nation, and yet the current president has said that we are no longer a Christian nation, and I'm sort of flabbergasted by that. But I go back to the Founding Fathers. Do you think that they could envision any other religion except Christianity in America at the time?
Well, I think they could have envisioned it, but they didn't. They chose not to because they felt that if people would love God and put God first, that then they would love one another. And it was an idea of redistribution of wealth so that everyone present would have a sort of a common place to raise their families, to be involved in their own religious perspective, to set up their own principles and ideas, and that they would be free to do that without any imposition from someone in a higher place. And then in the living that out in their lives, it would be a nation that would be free to express themselves in common understanding about a specific principle or understanding.
We're going to get back to that question. Was Jesus a capitalist or was he a socialist? And when we look back over in Europe, this whole authoritarian culture that stressed the value of economic equality rather than liberty, I think that they came up with these great inventions of socialism and communism. And somehow that never got across the ocean. Well, at least it didn't in the first 200 years. It's starting to, bury its head in here, and we'll get to that. When we come back, we're going to start taking some of your phone calls. Our number is 239-9393. Joining me in studio this evening, a new friend. I will say a new friend in that I have just met him in the last 6 months, the Reverend Dr. James McKibbin. He's serving an interim ministry here in Indianapolis, but I've talked him into coming in because he loves to debate, and he has a perspective. In fact, before we came down here, we had a half-hour conversation with Rabbi Monty. And where was Rabbi Monty from?
Rabbi Monty is a friend of mine from Austin, Texas.
Austin, Texas. And he sort of gave us a perspective to keep us out of the giggle weeds. What do you say to people when you hear them say, America is not a Christian nation? Religious conservatives argue that the Founding Fathers intended the United States to be a Judeo-Christian country, but we have a president now that says it's not. Well, who's right? I thought we'd go back in time and sort of take a look at see what the tea leaves have told us over eons of time. And eons of time is nearly 250 years ago. We're going to take your calls this evening, 239-9393. Joining me in studio, the Reverend Dr. James McKibbin, who is a minister. He also has his Ph.D. And, James, is that in psychology?
That's correct.
That is correct. I feel like I'm on the bench right now. Anyway, he's in studio with me. We'll take your calls. We'll sort of get through this together. Are we still a Christian nation? Let's find out. Let's start off with Roderick here, though. Roderick, thanks for being part of the show. How are you?
All right. Thank you.
Well, what do you have to say to us?
Very interesting topic. Hey, first of all, even the so-called Christian deists, somebody's going to argue at some point during your show tonight that a lot of the founders were deists. Even those guys, though, understood every time they mentioned the word God, it was a Judeo-Christian God. It was not some unnamed God. It was always Judeo-Christian. So, but the second thing I want to talk about, you talked about capitalism and communism. As you know,
right. The
country first started out as a communal system, and then John Smith, because the people, for whatever reason, weren't carrying their weight, said, look, if you don't work, you don't eat. And that's a Christian principle. Unfortunately, we have this concept that Jesus was some kind of first-century hippie that went around just going, love, love, love. No, he wasn't just about that. He had some ideologies, and one was when the Romans, or actually the Jews, tried to get him to basically opposed the Romans, he said, look, pay your taxes. So Jesus wasn't against paying taxes. Jesus wasn't against radical or was some kind of radical one to overthrow the government like all these liberals and socialists. He wanted people to keep their taxes, keep the community intact.
All right, well, I'm going to throw this one right at James. James, what do you think? What do you think Jesus would have thought about all that? First of all, I want to go back to the thing. And I tell you what, before we get to that one, Roderick, you hang on because we've got a pastor here. We're going to deal with all of those. You don't work, you don't eat, but we've got a Baptist pastor here. Steve, how are you?
Doing good.
All right, now you're going to make the same point that I think Roderick just made.
Not really.
All right.
I come from the Baptist tradition, and founding fathers didn't like Baptists too much. They wish we'd kind of go away. We wouldn't register. We were the same as the Quakers and the Mennonites and those other minorities. So I truly believe I've read the documents. You'll notice that one of the founding fathers, and it depends on who you look at, whether it's Washington, Jefferson, or whatever, used the term creator, which was more of a deistic term. And that's kind of what brought them together. And then as far as is the United States a Christian nation, it depends on what you define as Christian.
All right. James, what do you think? First of all, why don't you explain to us what deist means? If the founding fathers were deists, what does that mean?
Well, deist is a philosophy, of course, of religion, and it has to do with reason and the natural world. In other words, how do you describe what you see or define what you see with reason? And in doing that took in particular kinds of philosophy, which meant if certain things happen in a certain context, how do you respond to that context? What kind of things do you give in exchange for either a gift or some other commodity? How do you deal with it? How do you handle with that? And it was done by reason. Yet these deists believe that the reason is what we do in observation of a created world by a creator. So they often talked about the created world by a creator, an architect who took over and really assumed responsibility.
So hence we have this preamble to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator, there's your deist, with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, tell me about what Christ would have said about what Roderick said. You don't work, you don't eat. Where was Christ on something like that? Well, and I realize that you can't speak for Christ, but what's your interpretation here?
Well, Again, I'm just a witness of what I read, what I observe, and what I see, and so I don't claim to be an expert in any of these categories other than just to say, here's what it appears to me to be as I have observed. Christ was interested in relationships. He was interested in a relationship with someone greater than self who had some principles to offer that would allow us to love those principles more than anything else. For instance, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, strength, and soul. That's your creator. That's right. The one who made all things possible. He's the great provider. So you pay respect to the provider. But then when you have a provider who gives you all of these great things, how do you distribute them? Right. Which is do unto others as you'd have done unto yourself. Distributing them in a fashion that each would receive an amount
all right, now
comparable to their need.
Right. Now, you make a point that there are two different – I've heard you tell me this before. There are two different types of poor. The one type of poor chooses a lifestyle that relegates them to a sense of poverty where they become very focused on themselves. Explain this to me, because we've got two different types of poverty. What's the first one?
Well, I think the first type of poverty we have is when people have the inability to be able to grasp the concepts that exist for them to be able to be self-supporting. And so they derive some behavior that will help them to feed themselves or to help them meet their needs as they understand that. And so they spend their time developing particular kinds of techniques. They stand on street corners. They come to churches and they solicit funds. Sometimes they do some other things like steal and whatever they can do to support the particular needs that they have as they understand them.
All right. And then the other type of poor?
The other type of poor is the poor, it appears to me it's a poor that Jesus talks about as he is giving the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall see the kingdom of heaven, or they shall be a part of the kingdom of heaven. That is individuals who have all ability to be able to glean as much wealth as they can, but yet they choose to give that all away and to live in the presence of those who are around them they're all in the same level because they choose to give it all away. And I think when we think about that, that was kind of the status in which Jesus wanted all to have, that we would all be seen as kind of equal. So when you go back to the deist, if that's true, that they were deist, and I think there's some indication of that the early founding fathers.
I would agree with it. I think they were. I agree with the minister.
Yeah, and I think I would too. But I think that in that they were still understanding that there needs to be this distribution of wealth to help one another to get along in life. Regardless, the poor will always be among us. There's no way to get away from that.
Let's go out here. We've got Bob, who's been waiting on a cell phone. Hey, Bob, thanks for being a part of the show. What have you got for me this evening?
Well, you're welcome. For one thing, I think we are still a Christian nation. I think we were founded as a Christian, Judeo-Christian nation, but all during our history, we have been, accepting as far as, that goes, of other religions. We've been a people that, has not turned anyone away or, ostracized anybody just because they do practice a different religion, as long as it's a peaceful religion, similar to what Judeo-Christian believes are practiced in this country.
I think we get turned around. We have religious freedom, and then we have people like Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who was the atheist who just turned this nation on its ear in the 50s and 60s. Let me ask you a question, Bob. Was Jesus a capitalist?
I believe he was a capitalist. I believe that God is a capitalist. If you look in the Scripture, it talks about the three people that one was given 5 talents and one was given 2 talents, whatever. And then when they came back, all of them.
That's pretty good. That's the story of the talents.
And he buried his. And he's chastised for burying it. But he said, Master, I knew you were a hard taskmaster, and I didn't want to put it to use and lose it. Sorry.
All right, Bob. I'll tell you what, I've never heard that part of the Scripture say as proof that Christ was a capitalist. What do you think, James? Was he a capitalist or a socialist? What was he?
Well, I think that's what I'm talking about. Our witness to Scripture is always has a different twist, and that's what I like about the Scripture because it is live, and so each of us get a different twist. But my idea about that talent is that here God is teaching us to share again, and He gives so much, and so the guy goes out and he multiplies that for himself, and then God gives him more. And I don't think that's a capitalistic slant. I think that's a sharing of what he has gleaned. The real bottom line to that story is about the guy who got the 1 talent, and he went out and buried it. That's a real selfish kind of...
He didn't do diddly squat.
He didn't do diddly squat. And as a result of that, that's a very selfish person.
All right, so what would God say about Gates, Bill Gates? What would he say about Warren Buffett? Well, and I'm not asking you to be God, and I'm not asking you to be Jesus, but it seems to me that is the very essence of success in America. We idolize these people, but and if we are truly Judeo-Christian, is that what we need to be idolizing? Where do you see this? What would God be saying to these guys?
When I see those kind of things, all of those gentlemen are great, beneficent people who give large volumes of money to various organizations, and they have established trust in which can be drawn on from years. And when I think of Milton Hersey, I think of someone who gave a lot of money early on, and today that fund is so large they can never spend it. So here are some generous people. But the idea about that is that they have plenty for themselves.
Interesting. When we come back, more of your calls. My name's Denny Smith. We're talking about the founding principles of our founding fathers. Were they Christian? Were they Judeo-Christian? What were they trying to accomplish when we were talking about freedom of religion? We also have a president who has indicated that we are no longer a Christian nation. We are, I'm not sure what we are, but when we hear people say that America is not a Christian nation, and yet religious conservatives argue that the Founding Fathers clearly wanted us to be a Christian nation, well, who's right? In studio, the Reverend Dr. James McKibbin, and we're talking about the Judeo-Christian principles that founded our nation. Where are we with all of that? We're taking your phone calls, 239-9393. You can take it whatever direction you want. We're just trying to make sure that when we hear people say we are no longer a Christian nation, well, is that founded in fact, or is that just opinion? Let's see what we've got out here. Here's an old friend, Larry, on the south side. How are you, sir?
Hey, Denny, you know this is a real serious thing that we can't get over. Man who speaks always creates God in his own image. And Christianity has been one of the most destructive religions that have ever been on the scene. Why? Because it forgives man for his sin without any consequences. That's why we've made all the progress that we've made over the last 2,000 years. But the only thing that will control man's perverse nature is the law. If we don't have a law that's distributed among our people evenly, then we don't have anything, and that will bring the end of our civilization will be caused by Christianity. The Founding Fathers, I don't know what they've done. They were desperate men. They'll try anything they can to get away with the sins they commit. So we need to take a real close look, like you talked about treaties and stuff last night. Everybody does the suspect of what the treaty might have been about, but you need to go and read the books. And there is philosophical books and historical books that you can mix together and see. I think Will Durant was our last philosopher. That's who I studied. And it's just the perversity of our nature will do anything to cover it up.
All right, buddy. Hey, thanks for the call. I appreciate you calling in. All right, James, there we go. Christianity is destructive because it is based on forgiveness of sin. Now, I've not heard that before. Can you get me through the giggle weeds on that one?
Well, I think, that anything we do can be destructive. I mean, we could drink too much coffee, even though it wakes us up, we can drink it to the point where it kind of destroys that opportunity.
Let's get right to what Larry was saying. Larry was saying that if we steal, if we commit murder, that there is forgiveness through Christ, and yet that behavior is destructive. I would rather say that it might be redemptive, that it gives us a second chance at things. But I suppose anybody can. That's like that deathbed conversion thing. You can be a rascal your whole life and break every rule in the book, and then all of a sudden at the last minute you have this deathbed conversion and you all get into heaven. I don't know how I feel about that.
Well, I think there are all kinds of ways to look at things, but I would like to look at the whole idea that forgiveness is that position in life that allows us to be in relationship with each other. And if we're in that relationship,
I agree with that there's something good for you when you are issuing the forgiveness. But he makes the point about the law, too, that we are indeed a nation of laws.
I don't think forgiveness is separated from the law. I think grace and forgiveness is a part of judgment. And true judgment always allows for grace, and it allows for forgiveness.
I don't think I've ever heard Christianity described as a destructive force before. David from Plainfield. How are you, David?
I'm doing well, thank you, Denny.
Good. What do you have for me this evening, David?
Well, it's been a varied discussion. I got a couple of things that I believe I'd like to say. First of all, I think Jesus was a humanist. You can't. I hate to avoid the two answers, but communism, socialism, economic and cultural definitions are things that we came up with. And after all, the Bible says that the government will be on his shoulders. So he's the foundation. He was here to help us become closer to God. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about was the status of where we are as a country. Obama can hide, behind Islam all he wants, which is what he's doing, revoking the National Day of Christian Prayer in the White House in favor of the Islamic Day of Prayer. But the bottom line is we were founded as a Christian nation, but we've taken a lot of time and effort to throw him away in every circumstance that we can, from education to the law itself, and we only call on him when there's a day of national tragedy. So, I think we're at a point where we could get back there, but we really need to stand up for what is written, and we need to, instead of listening to what the media tells us that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and Declaration of Independence says, and read it for ourselves.
All right. Thank you, David. I appreciate you giving a call. All right. James, I just got an email. Well, Denny, It took about 5 minutes to figure out that he's a socialist. I think he needs to spend more time in the Bible and less in psychology books. His interpretations of talents, where did he get that? He must be Episcopal. Good grief. All right. Do you think you're a socialist?
Well, not really. I guess I'm open to labels. That certainly that email says that I've been labeled in a variety of ways.
He must be Episcopal. I don't think you're Episcopal. All right. Well, let's just deal with this. I don't really think that Christ was a socialist, and I don't think that. And that was that first email that I got from Matt that said it is hard to accept that Christ would have been a capitalist. How do we reconcile Christ as either a capitalist or socialist? Where was he in that?
I don't think he was either. I think he was a man who wanted to share with the world the idea of being in relationship with each other and sharing with each other in ways that brought fulfillment. And that's what he did. He took the worst of the worst and he brought them together. He took the legalist and he took the tax collectors and he took those he knew they were constantly fighting with him, and he brought them together and tried to help them to understand their relationship to each other with differences and yet get along. And he was the kind of the catalyst in all of that to help them in that process. So I don't think he was any of those. I think he wanted everyone to experience their needs being met and that they could be in relationship with each other as a result.
Here's what I'm going to sort of cut this down, then we're going to go right back to these calls. But my sense is that anybody who professes to be a Christian is really looking for some serenity. And in their religion, Christ brings some serenity. The way I have reconciled this in my own mind is that the Founding Fathers, I think, wanted to provide a way for us within our legal system, within our Constitution, within our law, that all citizens could attain serenity on their own terms with their own God. I don't think Christ was a capitalist. I think he would have approved of capitalism. I truly don't think he was a socialist. Every time I look at the attempts to redistribute wealth based on nothing else other than the number and how many breaths you take, I don't get that reconciled in the Bible. Is that in the Bible? I don't see anything to really bring that together.
To bring redistribution,
Yeah.
so that we each have a kind of an equal amount and can say that there's not one better than the other, or there's not any status.
Well, that's status before God. I'm talking about that if one man, go back to the talents. You got a 1-talent guy, you got a 5-talent guy, and a 10-talent guy. The 1-talent guy doesn't do diddly squat. He buries it, and he gets ripped by the master.
Right.
The guy who had 10 talents, in other words, the wealthy man, doubles it and makes 20 talents, and he gets praised by the master. Now, that's not necessarily saying that capitalism is good or bad, but it does tell me that we are expected to use our talents, and I think that's sort of a promotion of capitalism and far from socialism, which is the redistribution. Lay me out here. I mean, what does Jim say? Jim says you're an Episcopalian. I don't know where that comes from, but
well, I don't either.
Yeah.
I mean, but that's a label that maybe has some context for him in regard to how I respond to certain kind of questions. That's okay. I think that when you look at the talent story again, whenever you bury anything, regardless if it's 1 talent or 100 talents or whatever, what you're really doing is you're laying that up for a future day, thinking that nothing else is going to come from this good master who gave you 1 talent. Yeah. These other people who received the other talents recognized that they had some opportunity to share. Is that capitalism? I don't necessarily think it's capitalism, but they didn't make that by themselves. They certainly involved other people. And there's something about, in my mind, in my witness, that relationship was occurring with those people who received those talents with other people, and I don't think they were the only ones that made anything as a result of that. I think there were other people involved, so there may have been some redistribution.
I guess everybody has their own way of looking at things. My idea, I think that one of the beauties of having wealth is that you get to give it away. I find nothing more serene and nothing more comforting than to be able to do that. We're talking about our founding fathers, the fact that they tried to base our new democracy, our new republic, on Judeo-Christian principles. We've sort of been taken to task on that in the last, 18 to 24 months. We have been reminded by our current president that we are no longer a Christian nation. And at first when I heard that, I took offense, and then I tried to stand back and say, let's take a look at where this is coming from. I still cannot reconcile, James, that we are no longer a Judeo-Christian nation. I still believe in my heart that we're still there. The same principles, our law, and everything. What's your perspective on that one?
I think that we should recognize that we do have opportunity to share those Christian principles in the context of our nation. No one's keeping us from doing that. We can pray when we want to. We can go to church when we want to. We can establish meetings in the name of Christ. And I suspect that when you say that we're no longer a Christian nation, that has something to do with maybe governing. Does a Christian want someone else to govern them? Do we want the state to be over us?
I tell you what, now there may be a point there that we are no longer governing as probably was intended by and I cannot presuppose to be in their heads, but I rather imagine they wanted us to govern this nation as Christians or Judeo-Christian principles. Let's go out and grab a call here. We've got Bill who's got a point to make about Freemasonry. Hey, Bill, how are you?
Oh, I'm just lovely tonight.
Well, lovely's good. All right, so what do you have for me?
Well, not only were the founders of this country, Washington, Jefferson, Ben Franklin, not only were they Christians, but they were also Freemasons.
Very much so.
And if you understand the properties of Freemasonry, it's not surprising to see that they are in the Declaration of Independence written by a Freemason.
Yes, they are. They are. You're a traveling man, obviously.
Obviously. There's if I could, I'd like to make another point kind of off subject.
All right.
With your permission. But, yes, we are a Christian nation. I pray to God that we maintain that status as a Christian nation, and I hope our current president in the next couple of years is unemployed.
Okay. Fair comment. Thanks for your call. Let's go out to Darlene here. Darlene, thanks for taking time to give us a call. How are you this evening?
Oh, fine. Thank you for taking my call.
What point did you want to make?
It was asked about if our nation is a Christian nation. At one time, we lived according to, or was based on God's Word, the Holy Bible. But I feel that we've drifted from that. But in 2 Chronicles 7:14, it says, "If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven. I will forgive their sin and heal their land." And being truly sorry for your sins, that you don't want to do them again. That's how I feel about my sins, that Jesus forgave me of me. And if I do something wrong, I say, "Lord, forgive me," and I get right back up and I go again. And concerning the Matthew 5, about in verse 3, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The poor in spirit, I've heard it preached that you have the humility that I need God's help in every single area of my life.
Darlene,
that's the poor in spirit.
Darlene, thanks for calling. I appreciate you taking time. Our number is 239-9393. Max is in Plainfield. Max, what do you think about Jesus and capitalism?
Well, Denny, it kind of struck me that I'm familiar enough with the Bible to kind of know it in general, and I believe one of the 10 Commandments is, "Thou shalt not covet not just thy neighbor's wife, but by thy neighbor's goods," or, depending on what version of a mule you're talking about, the verbiage may be a little bit different, but we get the drift. And in my mind, I think that means that God and Jesus through the Father doesn't intend for people to covet things that they have not rightfully come by themselves. Which kind of gets back to the issue of distribution of wealth.
All right, I take your point there. James, what do you think about ambition? Capitalism and ambition are sort of tied together. And, I keep going back to David. You make this point about David, that he was God's chosen one, that David screwed up a lot. What was it that God liked about David? Because David was ambitious. David was covetous. David had all these things, but how did he end up being God's chosen one? What was special there?
David had that remarkable ability to know that he had sort of gone way off base. He was told by Nathan, hey, you're a bad boy. You've done the wrong kind of thing. And immediately he fessed up to that. And in the process of fessing up to that, he asked God to forgive him. And, as a result of asking for forgiveness and being reinstated again into relationship with God, even though he'd go against that again and again.
Again and again.
But the thing that he did was he always knew he was wrong and he wanted to make it better. And that seems to me to be a real asset for us. If we really feel sorry about what we've done, we really get that kind of forgiveness that comes both from God and from those that we've sinned against. That gives us the ambition to continue to do the right thing. We just need to continue to do the right thing. God is saying, if you continue to do the right thing, I'll always bless you. If you seek my face, if you pray, if you hear me, I'll hear you from heaven. I'll bless you. I like that 2 Chronicles 1:7-14.
The whole idea of capitalism, I cannot give up on capitalism. I think Christ was probably closer to capitalism, but he expected it to be shared. I don't see him on communism. I don't see him on fascism. I don't see him on socialism. I do not see him there. I do see him wanting to share bounty, but not by the hand of any government agency. I just don't see that in Christ. You set me straight right now, because I just don't see that in his soul.
Well, I don't know how you label him a capitalist. I think we need to label him as a fair person who really wanted to do the right thing for all people, and to say that all people could be taken care of if all people would take care of people. That's the real essence here, that if we take care of each other, we're not going to have all of these coveting kind of things, because we're going to spend time in the process of trying to help others. And when we help others, when we give, we always receive. It's more blessed to give than it is to receive.
Well, it's a lot more satisfying.
It's a lot more satisfying.
Well, as long as you're under the age of 5, that works the other way.
Right.
It's more blessed to receive. But after we get past 5 years old, we have to understand it's more fun to give.
And you always, when you give, you always have. I mean, you can't give if you don't have. Whether that's
all right. I will give you that. Maybe Christ would not. I think Christ would approve of capitalism. I can't label him a capitalist. I can't label him a socialist either. But I think that the whole idea of the talents that when we multiply, I think we are finding God's grace for sure. The voice you hear in the background here is that of the Reverend Dr. James McKibbin, who has joined me in studio. My name is Denny Smith. Tonight we're just looking back at what our founding fathers hoped to create in this nation. Were they deists? Certainly they were Christians. They wanted to found this nation on Judeo-Christian principles. In studio with me this evening is the Reverend Dr. James McKibbin. He is just an old farm boy from up in northern Indiana. Dairy farmer, James? Is that what it was, dairy farming?
That's exactly right.
And ended up in the ministry, ended up down in Texas. He is serving an interim ministry up here in Indianapolis, which is how I have befriended him. I have asked him to come into studio because I'm trying to get my arms around how different the United States of America was when it was founded back in the 1700s. And James, and here's how I'm coming about this. Thomas Jefferson wrote, as this preamble, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And by the way, I'm not a big fan of the Pledge of Allegiance for every class. I believe in the Pledge of Allegiance, and I say it willfully and proudly. I would much rather see every grade school child say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Help me through this. All of the European nations that our founding fathers came from and saw were totalitarian in one way or another. They came, this Judeo-Christian American, one finds the idea of equality before God and the law, but not government-forced economic equality. And so there's these modern European cultures that stress the value of economic equality rather than liberty, I think was an aversion to them. What I think when I look at what they saw themselves as Christians or as deists, as you say, is that I think that they felt for the first time in America that man could have relationship with man, the citizen could have relationship with citizen to build their country, rather than this responsibility to an authoritarian rule. What's your perspective of the way we were founded in that vein?
Well, it appears, we read everything that somebody else writes, and they wrote it in their own perspective, and so we don't know exactly how they were thinking or where they were coming from. In regard to that, they tell us they were they were Christian or they were Judeo-Christian, and we can't discuss with them other than what they've written. But it just appears that there's an importance about camaraderie that builds a nation, regardless of what a person believes about another person's perspective, whatever that is. If I can accept that person's perspective without arguing with them, allow them to perform that perspective as they understand it, as long as it don't get into those unalienable rights, then we've accomplished something which is important, which binds us together and makes us powerful. For you see, it's not the one person or the two people that have power, but it's a group of people. And exciting to me is that as we get closer to what we think is a non-Christian nation, maybe we get closer to being a Christian nation and begin to look at what am I doing to make this world a better place, by the way I live, by what I do, by how I treat my fellow man, by how I share, by how I listen.
You made the point that the fact that our Judeo-Christian heritage, same God, from the 10 Commandments, we came down to 2.
That's correct.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And yet they also said, love your neighbor as yourself. We had not seen that in any European culture. We had not seen that in any other culture, and yet they bring it down, and it's remarkable that we have this Constitution that came out of these two principles, love God and love your neighbor. And I think that they did it. And I will give them credit that they did get their Judeo-Christian principles in there. And so when I hear again that we are no longer a Christian nation, it still rags me a little bit. I'm just grouchy about that, and I cannot see that is not, whenever there's a disaster, is it not the American helping other people at all times? I just do not see that we are no longer a Christian nation. Any perspective?
Well, I just think that each of us look at what's going on and with the information that we have, and we define that as we understand it. And so if the statement is made it's no longer a Christian nation, that doesn't mean it isn't a Christian nation. It just means for the one who made the statement, it's not a Christian nation for them. It's not the Christian principles by which and for which they are obligated.
It tells us more. That tells us more about the speaker than of the fact that
tells us more about that one that shares, and it tells about those of us who make proclamation that we are Christian and that we take great pride in sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. I believe that he's made it possible for us to have hospitals and schools, and he's just done education facilities beyond even our imagination.
Bruce from India is going to join us now. Bruce, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well tonight. Great topic, I got to admit. Again, our great president fails to read the Constitution. But I wanted to add, I am a direct descendant of a man named Jonathan Edwards.
Oh, right.
It's on my grandfather's side. My grandfather was a preacher for 62 years up until the age of 92 when he finally retired. And Jonathan Edwards is credited with bringing Christianity from England. Him and his buddies, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, and all of those founded Harvard, Princeton, and Yale universities in the Northeast. He was a Quaker, but the one thing that you can take from him bringing Christianity to the United States from England is that we will not be like the Church of England. We will accept all forms of Christianity, which means, basically you're Catholic, you're Episcopal.
That's a really good point, Bruce. James, you said earlier, how many different denominations do we have in the United States of, I'm going to say Christianity. I don't, not just Protestantism, but Christianity. How many different denominations are out there?
Just several years ago, there was a new history of all the churches that we have in the United States, and there were 251 that were included in that particular discourse. It's about a 500-page book, and it gives a good description of each of the churches and what they believe in and how they profess their faith, and then how they interact in faith.
So we can't even 251 different. So everybody's got a different handshake and a secret password.
Everyone's got their own particular kind of presence in the world in which we live, and I think that's a part of the forefathers' idea about having everyone. I
think they would be very comfortable with the fact that we had 251. John in Pendleton, how are you this evening?
I'm doing all right.
Good. Well, you had some information about Thomas Jefferson.
I don't know why everyone keeps calling him a Christian. He's the one that wrote our Declaration of Independence, and he wasn't for any church ruling over our nation. Our nation was founded on religious freedoms, not just Judeo-Christian beliefs.
I think that you're right. When I talk of the Founding Fathers, although Thomas Jefferson was one, it's pretty clear that you would not necessarily put him in the Christian camp, James.
Well, I don't know that I would put him in the Christian camp.
But he was more of a deist.
He was more of a deist, but he actually plagiarized Thomas Paine's writing on the freedoms of the world. I mean, he almost plagiarized Thomas Paine's writing.
I still think that he got it right, though, in the preamble of the Declaration.
I think he got it right.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and there was a man that held slaves, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let's talk. I tell you what, when we come back, we'll talk about that term. What we all learned as unalienable is really unalienable. And when we come back, we'll explain what that means. Right here on 93 WIBC. My name's Denny Smith. Please don't take offense when I say that I would much rather have somebody say the preamble to the Declaration of Independence rather than the Pledge of Allegiance. And it's for this reason. We hold these truths to be self-evident. In other words, this is just so obvious it doesn't need to be said, that all men are created equal. We believe that in our hearts and souls as Americans, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Though unalienable means a lien is something you put on property when you have not been paid. And a lien is a debt that is owed to you, and you attach something to property, whether it's a home or a car. Those are called mechanics liens or property liens. But here we are told that in our preamble that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Only in America, James, only in America up to this point was that ever possible. Not in India, not in Pakistan, certainly not in France, Germany, Prussia. All of those places, they had a king. They had somebody that they were accountable to, but not in America. I think Christ would be very, very happy with that. That the allegiance was to God and to somebody else, but certainly not to a king. It
gave opportunity for everyone to express to a higher power, as they understood it, their idea about how to live in the presence of that higher power, to glean strength from that, and then to live in the presence of each other and allow each other with those unalienable rights to get along and form a union. That a union does not imply unity. It implies that we are together for the reason that we hold these truths to be self-evident.
When we get back, we're going to take John here, and then I want to ask you the question that Matt Hiblin asked us. How would Jesus feel about us engaged in war? Now, there's certainly wars in Bible perspective, but we'll talk about Jesus' perspective on that when we come back. But first of all, we're going to take John because he's been waiting forever. John from Whiteland, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great, gentlemen. How are you?
Real well. All right, give me your perspective.
My perspective is, from listening to the whole commentary and just from both of your last comments, it would be my impression that you're both Masons. Because I am a Mason. And part of what we've believed in, the same as our founding fathers have always believed in, is that the only prerequisite to be a member is that you believe in a supreme being.
That is so true. In Masonry, there is no differentiation between the Jew, or the Christian, and now
or
certainly
whether you want to call him Buddha, you want to call him Allah.
As long as you have that belief, and again, that was the deist, that there was a higher being, there was a creator, and you're absolutely.
The thing I keep hearing over and over from both of you gentlemen is a belief in a supreme being.
I don't know how anybody, honest to goodness, and maybe we ought to talk about this. How does anybody go through life and see everything that we see and profess to be an atheist? I never did get Madalyn Murray O'Hair. I never understood that, James. And, of course, you're a man of the cloth, and I cannot reconcile so many different things in life without there being a God. I just can't do it. But yet, you see that all the time.
Well, it's interesting, again, that you in order to be an atheist, you have to believe that somebody believes there is a God, and then it's an argument about taking all the principles that God sets forth, arguing that they don't exist. So it takes as much faith to be an atheist as it does to be a Christian or a Muslim or a whatever, because you have to grind out all of those things that is attributed to that supreme being and say that doesn't exist.
Right. All right, we're going to take Richard and Mitchell, and then we're going to start talking about some war here. Richard, how are you, sir?
Hey, I'm doing fine, Denny.
Good. What do you have to share?
Well, just a few things. Yeah, I'm a Mason and proud of it. And I'm really kind of tired of all these people calling Masons atheists. And
no. Couldn't be further from the truth.
Well, a lot of people do. And I'm proud of it. Number one, you were talking about God being capitalist or socialist. I think God wants, like you said, all of us to reward others with those things that we have. I do know that in Old Testament scripture, and you can ask your guest, I believe it's in the Old Testament and part of the New Testament, where I think it was every 7 years all loans were forgiven. In other words, if I borrowed some money for you,
seven times 7. It was called Jubilee, if I remember right. James, yeah.
It's called a year of Jubilee, 50 years. Every 50
years. Okay, thank you. Is that socialism or is that capitalism? I think God intended for all of us, to work hard for whomever we work for, whether it was our land or someone else's land.
I think that the founding fathers would have died if they'd have thought they had to reset like that. But
I do too.
Yeah, you hang on here, Richard. I'm going to just slip you back there. Talk about Jubilee. Now, Jubilee was in the Jewish tradition the 7 times 7 years, 7 years
and
plus
the
50th.
The 50th, you forgave all the debts, and then you started over again. And
but who got the property? I mean, when you forgive all the debts, let's say that, James, I had taken care of your fields, your vineyards, and you owed me money. In the year of Jubilee, you didn't owe me any more money.
That's correct.
Okay, who got the vineyard?
Well, I think that at that point, what the story really around all of that is that the people who have the ability to do work and to be entrepreneurs will, in 49 more years, they're going to regain all that they ever gave away. That's
right.
just kind of the process in which people be. I have a friend who's lost his business to 3 different businesses 3 different times, but each time came back and became a millionaire over again because he has this entrepreneurial kind of attitude that he never loses.
So that's the story of Jubilee.
So the story of Jubilee is that, it's all going to return. It's going to come back again. It's kind of a cycle. And so let's not make the cycle so long that we have to totally change our currency in order to start over again.
All right. Now, we're going to get out in an area that Matt asked us to at least take a look at, and that is, what would Christ say, or what would the Judeo-Christian principles say about wars? Now, we saw David in wars. We saw a lot of the Jewish people in wars, but we find ourselves right now engaged in 2 or 3 different wars across the United States. What would, and I know you can't speak for him, but what do you think what would Christ's perspective be of these wars right now?
Well, I don't. When you read the Bible, what I find is that Christ meets everyone where they are, and he accepts them for who they are, and then they'll ask a question about who they are, and he'll ask them another question, and he'll say, well, what do you think about that? And then he may tell them a story about kind of how a person related or acted. For instance, let's take a look at a story in the Bible just to sort of bring it into focus. Interesting to me, the story of the Good Samaritan is about who is my neighbor. And, of course, we know that story that they're passed by religious folks. But along comes this Samaritan who is a foreigner in the land, who's not accepted by anyone, and he sees this gentleman beside the road, and he gets off of his piece of equipment that he's riding, his steed, and he begins to doctor him, and he puts him on the steed, and he takes him into town, and he puts him in an inn. And in the process of putting him in, he said, hey, if he's here a couple of more days and what I give you money for, what take care of him? Which is to say that it's how we treat people regardless of who we are, and not to put people in boxes. But we neither should we be critical of the priest who walked by on the other side, because he knew he wasn't responsible for that person. He was just doing his duty. He wanted to continue to be a part of the temple the next day. He didn't want to be dirty. He wanted to bring God's blessings upon the people. He had a job. He did his job. The other gentleman comes by and he looks and he sees it's not his family. And so he's not responsible. The law makes him not responsible for that. This other gentleman didn't have a law. I mean, all he had was he had a good heart. And so Jesus says that's the neighbor. Who is the neighbor there? Well, the neighbor is the guy who picks up the guy along the road and puts him up for the night.
So if we have a fellow nation that is out there that is in need of support, are you saying that we can somehow justify the conflict? Or are we saying that you're not saying that?
I'm not saying that.
I know you're not saying that.
I'm not saying that a conflict is justifiable. Yet what I am saying is that I think that in the process of life and living, we need to be aware that we're always going to have conflicts, because people have strong senses of me or I, and that protective kind of state always gathers around it a group of people who wants to support that part of freedom. Jesus always, in his intact people, I mean, he'd have you carry the wear of a soldier just because you were a person who could do it. But he didn't care for the fight in the war. In fact, when he could have fought, he didn't. He gave up his own life.
He took some whoopings too.
He took some spittings and whoopings.
When we come back, we've got Ron from the East Side. Room for your phone call, too. The number's 239-9393. Just this whole prospect of Judeo-Christian values, where it is in America. Do we still have it when we hear the comments that we are no longer a Christian nation? I don't believe it, but I'd like your perspective, too. Give me a call, 239-9393. The number's 1-800-571-WIBC. Well, tomorrow evening, do we have a show for you? Forget everything you ever heard about UFOs. Tomorrow night we're going to be talking to an aerospace engineer and a historian who really is going to open up your eyes and probably my eyes all over again. No kidding. Don't miss this show tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Currently in studio I have the Reverend Dr. James McKibbin, who's become a friend over the last. I met James in February of this year, and I have enjoyed his company, and I've enjoyed the intellectual jousting with this old farm boy from... Where are you from, James? What part of Indiana?
Warsaw, Indiana.
Warsaw, Indiana. What county is that? Kosciuszko. So that's just south of Elkhart. That's one line of counties south of the Michigan border.
It's just a stone's throw from Touchdown Jesus.
From Touchdown Jesus. Well, we all know who Touchdown Jesus is. All right, let's go out and talk to Ron on the East Side. Ron, how are you this evening?
Hey, Denny. I am great, and I thank God for it.
Well, good.
Denny, let me preface what I'm about to say with a couple of things. First thing I want to say is love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. I want to follow that up with, I believe that Jesus Christ died for my sins. Now, let me get in a couple of comments. One in particular, when I often hear, because I listen to Greg, even though I disagree, I listen to Greg, and I listen to a lot of shows. But in particular, when I hear us talking about the Founding Fathers and I hear the praise that is heaped on those guys, and this was the other part I told your call screener. This is the perspective from a 54-year-old black male. Denny, a lot of the guys that we call Founding Fathers could have wound up on Dateline going to jail. I won't get into the specifics, but I think you may understand that. If I need to get into specifics, I can, but I won't.
Well, I think I understand. Many of our Founding Fathers had slaves. There's no question. And I have never reconciled that, Ron. I guess I don't forgive them. I think it was part of their culture. I can't stand in judgment of them, but I don't know how to respond to it.
For me, they call themselves Christians.
Right.
I'll move on from that one.
All right. Well, thanks, because I'm sweating over here. I appreciate that.
No. I'll move on from that one.
All right.
When they asked Christ, should we pay taxes? He told them, he said, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's. In this day and age, if you remember this, the disciples who walked with Jesus Christ, who could say, peace be still, and the water and the waves and the winds come to a calm, the disciples actually carried swords. It would make you wonder why that occurred, because when they came to take Christ away, Peter cut off an ear, and it wasn't with his hand.
Right.
Other than that, even though we are supposed to, if we get slapped on one side, turn the other, I don't believe that that's what he meant for a nation to give itself away to its enemies.
You know, that's a good point.
Just cause for war, when there's a just cause, the same way you would defend your family, you defend your neighborhood, you defend your city, your state, you defend your country.
Ron, when we were in this last break, James and I looked at each other and we talked about taking up arms. I don't think that there's any question that all of us would take a bullet for our family. But I think what James and I just said, we pray to God that we don't never have to make the decision of whether to defend our family with aggression. And I hear that in your voice too. That I think our job is to defend, and I just hope and pray that I'm never. We would all take the bullet. We would all do that for our wives, for our mothers, for our fathers, for our children. But
I hope I never do, Denny. I hope I never do. But partly out of my job and partly out of other things, I am a card-carrying Democrat who also happens to carry that little pink card that says I can carry a gun for life.
Good for you. Ron, I appreciate your perspective this evening, and I do appreciate you taking time to call. You take care, okay?
Thanks.
All right, buddy. 239-9393. Next up is Mark from Indy. Mark, how are you this evening?
Pretty good. How you guys doing?
Real well. We've covered a lot of ground tonight.
Yes, you have. I was calling in response to when you said if you thought we were still a Christian nation. To me, the basic principle of Christianity is the ability to suffer and to sacrifice for what is good and for what is godly. But even if you wanted to go just on the most basic of that, would be at least the ability to suffer or to sacrifice. And unfortunately, in our society today, I think it's based too much around a selfish consumerism. That even within the church, you find people, they want to sit in chairs that are comfortable. They want to sing particular music that's their music. They want their hamburger their way, their songs their way. I mean, it's our entire, at least secular culture, seems to be influencing the church more than the church the other way around. That we've lost the ability to suffer or to sacrifice.
I thought we covered a lot of ground up to this point. What do you think? Is it the self-centeredness of each of us in our perspective of religion, James? I mean, I like those soft cushions in church. I like the fact that the church is air-conditioned, and I like the music in a pleasant way. What am I missing here?
Well, I think we go right back to the beginning of the writing of the Bible, and we find that there are two people there. Not necessarily do we want to think just two people, but I think it's a great story about two people who wanted to be more than they were, and they wanted to be like God and to be able to make a choice about what they do. God already had worked out all these things and knew there was only a right choice, and so they just kind of fooled around until the pair on the ground actually went against God, and from that point on, they had the opportunity to make choice. And the opportunity of making choice is I have to defend my right to be me. I can't get around that. It's just the way it is. And so we all have differences about how we see life, how we see people.
Has it changed us as a nation? I suppose that's been, if that's original sin, we've been going back, to those choices. Those choices of decisions within culture were in the 1700s as they were in the 1800s, 1900s. I'm not sure that – I think our culture is different here, obviously, in the 21st century, but I think the issues are still the same. Do we choose freedom over totalitarianism? Do we choose a Christian nation over a non-Christian nation. And I still think we come back to that, and I still think that the preponderance of the evidence shows that we are still a Christian nation, and we still choose freedom first over a central authority. And we better get back to some phone calls. 239-9393. Next up, we have Terry, who is in Brownsburg. Hey, Terry, how are you?
Oh, not too bad. How's Denny?
Denny's all right. What do you think?
Well, first, I believe that Jesus was a capitalist because, he was raised as a Jew. His dad was a carpenter. He was a carpenter's son. And also the Bible says, if you don't work, you shan't eat. And even Paul scolded, I think it was the Corinthian church, because they thought Christ was coming back soon, and they stopped working. He called them gluttons. So that's...
Yeah, I think that that was in Thessalonians. Somebody else, I think it was Roderick who sent this into. He says, "For even when we were with you, we commanded you this: if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat." Was that Paul?
Yeah,
James?
That's Paul.
Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, that was Paul who wrote that.
Yeah, and then he went on, and when some of Jesus' disciples chastised the woman who poured the expensive oil on his feet, the disciples saying it should have been sold to feed the poor, and Jesus sort of smacked them down and said, "Why you trouble this woman? She's done a good work for me. For you have the poor with you always, but me you will not always have." So I think he had some attitudes about money. You make a good point there. Give me your perspective as a theologian here, James. What was Jesus doing when he was saying, let her pour this expensive oil on my feet? Now, what was that all about?
I think, again, that's a matter of a value. The value being that here's someone who really shared with another person in the process of life an ultimate goal of having connection, and that goal is rewarded by the best gift that person has, and Jesus is saying to her, okay, this is what it's all about. This is loving God first.
Yeah, and the disciples said, "What are you doing?
What are you doing?
This is worth $1,000. We could take this out and give it to the poor." And he says, "Now wait a minute. That's not yours to give."
That's exactly.
Yeah, I like that a lot. My name's Denny Smith. In the studio with me, the Reverend Dr. James McKibbin, who has joined us here for just some perspective of, are we still a Christian nation? Was America founded on Judeo-Christian principles? Probably no question about that. But what are your perspectives? Our number is 239-9393. It's 1-800-571-WIBC. Thanks for being a part of the show. We have tried to do a little bit of witnessing, a little bit of faith management, and tried to take a historical perspective of what the United States of America was all about, how we were founded. What are those Judeo-Christian values and principles that have been a part of us for so very, very long? James, you've been saving a couple quotes. You are a man of quotes. Give me these quotes you've been saving for me.
Well, it's interesting as I think about Thomas Paine, who was copied by Thomas Jefferson in the writing of the Constitution. And, of course, common sense was just him going against the government in
Great Britain.
In Great Britain. He made a quote of times that we're talking about and about these gentlemen. He said, his quote was, "These are the times that try men's souls."
And it could be, I feel that every day when I get up. I have never been so aggravated, and I have to say that what was good in the 1700s is certainly good in the 2010s.
I think that's true.
Yeah. What was your other quote?
Well, I'm always enamored by people who gave themselves to what they believed. And Mahatma Gandhi, not necessarily Christian, but he made a statement in the 1940s about America, about this America that we're talking about on Judeo-Christian principles. He said, "I like your Christ. I don't like your Christians."
Oh, boy. Sometimes guilty is charged. Let's go to Mooresville, Indiana, down in Morgan County. Hi, Charles. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good. What point do you have for me this evening?
Well, I would just like to see religion taken out of our government. I know we were founded on religion and government, and they're both great. I mean, I love religion, I love our government. But I think that our government now is taken over by religion and money. If it weren't for people like Sarah Palin, even Mike Huckabee, he didn't run for president. He says he could fix our country, but he's making so much money that he's building a new house in Florida, and he's a minister. So if he thinks he can fix our country, and our country's so messed up, and I really enjoyed the quotes that you were just talking about. Those were both very true. If he really thinks he could fix our country, then he should have ran for president. We need somebody that's going to pull us out of this, not push us down just for money.
Charles, thanks for your thoughts. Sometimes when we mix Christianity or religion and politics, we get something that's a little bit strange. But thanks for your perspective. Next up, we have John. Hi, John. How are you?
Hi, Denny. Thank you for taking my call.
You bet.
The only thing I wanted to mention, kind of capitalism versus socialism. One of the things that has really been impressed upon me by Christianity, it is the success that good Christian people have, and they are able to share their bounty with others freely. And great things happen when that occurs. But when that money is confiscated by socialism and forced to be shared with others, great things don't come with that. And all one has to do is look at nations in not too distant past and just see that I think that's true. And I just think that this Judeo-Christian country that we've had has the tremendous success has been due in part to the benevolence of the good people of this nation.
I remember when I was growing up, and then I'm going to sort of pitch this to Jim. I remember when I was growing up, my mom or my dad asked me to do something, and I groused and whined and mewled and puked about it, but I did it. And then my dad took me aside and he said, when I ask you to do something, I would appreciate it if you do it with a glad heart. Now, I'm going to pitch that one to you because I think it's not so much that we need to have this logical redistribution of wealth, and that's what it really is. And I think that if we look at the final digestion of all this, we're looking for people to give with a happy heart and not have it pried out of them by some totalitarian regime. What do you think, James? What's expected of us from our religion?
I think if we don't give out of our heart, then to redistribute some of the wealth to those who are in need, then someone somewhere is going to take it upon themselves to legislate to us the needs that exist and will then take from us in order to make that redistribution. And that, to me, is part of what the church has lost their right to do. If everyone would have really taken seriously the 10% that the church was to do in regard to the redistribution of all kinds of things.
That would have been the cheapest, quote, tax we would have ever had.
We would be in great shape, and our people would, from a different heart, we would find that people cared more about each other, and we would be a union, not necessarily in unity, but a union.
One of these days I'll tell you the story about the very famous politician from here in central Indiana who, when I made him repeat it when he said it, he says, the purpose of government is the logical redistribution of wealth when the churches fail. And I was so flabbergasted that I stood up and made a butt out of myself. I said, would you say that again? I can't believe somebody said that in public. Let's talk to, let's see, we've got Bill here, if I can find the button. Hey, Bill, how are you, sir?
I'm doing just fine, Denny. How are you today?
It looks to me like you're going to be the last caller. What's your point for us this evening, Bill?
Well, I got two real quick ones if I can. One, from what I have been taught, and been in church all of my life, raised with preachers on both sides of my family, I believe Jesus is probably more concerned with the heart and soul of man than he was the pocketbook or politics.
Well, that I would agree with. What is your second point?
Well, I've always been taught when I'm making a decision, take out a sheet of paper, put a line down the middle of it, the pros on one side and the cons on the other side.
That's called a Ben Franklin.
That's right. When this president made his statement for about 2 minutes, I was madder than a cross-eyed hornet. Then I thought, well, if I took out a sheet of paper and put down on one side the things that he's got right, and on the other side the things this man has got wrong, I'd wear a pencil out on one side and not have much on the other one, so his opinion didn't much matter.
Bill, thank you for your call. I appreciate you all taking your time to call in this evening. And the Reverend Dr. James McKibbin, thank you for being a part of this show. I've enjoyed your company, sir.
My pleasure, Mr. Smith.
It's good to have you.